There's lots of rugby, lots of navel gazing in the rugby. Cian, we're on more familiar territory here. There's everything from the cold hard analysis of Bernard Jackman and Brendan Fanning and Peter Riley to, in the Mail on Sunday, Hugh Gallagher on Bernard Laporte. There's an interview with Bismarck to Plessis. There's Tommy Conlon on the issue of forced migration. There's Doug Howlett talking about his involvement with the Cork Hurlers. So there's a whole array of rugby right across the pages.
Yeah, there's a lot of good stuff there. I mean, it's an awkward week in terms of filling the column inches because you're kind of still half looking back and what's gone wrong in the Six Nations, but you're trying to bring it forward to the next 2 weeks as well. But
it has been the longest autopsy.
It really has. It really has.
Since Rome.
Yeah, at least we're having it now and not in the autumn, you know. But yeah, it's been a bit draining, all right, but I think even France, you know, winning last time, I think is going to focus the minds even more. If they got beaten again, you know, this week would be a bit slow as well, but then winning, I think, come Monday, Tuesday, the players are back in Carton House, it's just going to ramp up again, I think.
Yeah. What grabs you today? I'd start with the analysis in Ireland first. Bernard Jackman puts an exclamation mark after the suggestion all the Irish team need to do is go for a few drinks.
Yeah.
As if to say, those days are gone.
Yeah, I think people took that maybe a bit literally, like all week. I don't think anyone was suggesting that they should actually go on the batter.
Were they not? I thought a lot of people were literally saying they need to go for a few pints. And
that's just not going to happen, especially under Joe Schmidt's watch. But
would they not have gone out, do we not think?
I think, from what I hear, I think they went for a dinner, you know, and had a couple of drinks up in Belfast, and they did the black cab tour of the city. And while that might seem so banal and, you know, touristy stuff, it's not Carton House, and I think you can place a huge value on that because we hear so much Joe Schmidt talking about, you know, we're in the bubble. That bubble is as intense as it gets. So getting up to Belfast and having a dinner, change of scene, I think it could be a blessing in disguise. Yeah, Bernard Jackman makes the point that, yeah, he's been hearing about piss up, but I don't think he quite agrees with it. But I think he's probably fallen in the same opinion of me that people are a little bit getting carried away. You know, short-term memory. It was only a few months ago Ireland were beating the All Blacks. Johnny Sexton was Player of the Year. It's a good piece. It's calling for a bit of perspective. Perspective is important. There are reasons aplenty to be positive is the headline. I think that pretty much sums it up. I must say, I haven't seen anyone get carried away really. You know, I know. The general public, though, a lot of them are losing their minds.
You think so?
Oh,
losing their minds. I think a lot of them actually are saying, well, Six Nations, there's been a huge turnover of players. Somebody at the start, Peter O'Reilly at the start, it was, I mean, it crystallises things very nicely when you see it written down, just the turnover in player this year. I'll dig it out later on. Yeah. I get the sense, anyone I talk to, there's a kind of, look, it's a bit of a wobble, it's understandable, it's hard to keep at your peak the whole time. I think there's still a sense out there that they'll come good for the World Cup. You're not seeing that?
No, I think there is, but I've seen people on Twitter especially is a dangerous place for these sort of things, and you're seeing, you know, Schmidt needs to drop Sexton and Murray and these kind of things when the two best players are out of form. The last thing I think they need to do is be dropped. They need the game time to, you know, to get the form back. Yeah, I think in the immediate aftermath, I think it's slowed down a bit as the week went on, but I thought the first couple of days there was a bit of an overreaction, you know, comparing it to 2007 and things like that. I didn't quite agree with that.
Can I jump in there in Shane Horgan's defence? Because if you watch back what he said, he wasn't saying that I think we're headed for the 2007 World Cup.
Yeah.
He was actually just talking about this tournament, and he was saying what this Six Nations is reminding me of is 07, in that I understand how difficult it is to wrestle back momentum.
Yeah.
I don't think he was saying, oh, we're headed for World Cup, because he actually made the point they had a really good championship in 07, Six Nations, and they went into the tournament feeling great. So I think the 07 thing's been a big headline, but if you look at what Horgan was actually saying, he was definitely just saying it's going to be hard for them to wrestle back some of the momentum when you're in the midst of a tournament.
Yeah,
it's very hard to get it back.
That's a fair point. It certainly caught Joe Schmidt's attention because I saw he was asked about it up in Belfast, and I don't think he was too impressed. He wasn't too impressed with either.
Double tap that one to the ground. What did he say? Well, that's irrelevant.
That's irrelevant to us. It's an irrelevance. I think he said yes, which you can imagine that, of course, it is.
Spit in the ground afterwards, or is that unconfirmed?
No, that wouldn't be Joe Schmidt's style now, would it?
No, I wouldn't think so. The Peter O'Reilly stat, by the way, just before I forget to mention it. They had 22 starters over the entire 2018 Six Nations, and he says they've already had 24 in this one. So this whole thing in some ways can be as simplistic as well, as they haven't been as lucky with injuries. There's more chopping and changing.
Yeah, and I think at the start of Six Nations, most people, I certainly would have been of the opinion that it would be great to, you know, use the squad that you have here now. A lot of that has been forced, but against Italy, he still made changes that he didn't have to make. James Ryan at the weekend off, Rory Best. This is what you want, and when the performance wasn't as great as people expect, when you make so many changes, it's inevitable. I think Brendan Fanning's piece is quite good in this because he focuses on Sean Cronin, and I'd actually written a piece straight after the game as well, sort of, you know, it was his big chance to prove a point and he didn't take it, but there were other factors at play which why he didn't make it. Brendan Fanning was making the point that who would he rather be throwing the line out to, James Ryan and Devon Toner, who he trains with every day, and then he got Quinn Roux and Alton Delan. Quinn Roux is a relatively new line-out caller at this level, and while he went well against Scotland, it's a very different ball game, and I think the buck will always stop with the hooker, but Brendan makes the point that, you know, it will always stop with him, but he makes an interesting point that following the tour to Australia, that Sean Cronin was disciplined for, which was interesting.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, I hadn't actually seen that before, so that might explain some of it. But I don't think Sean Cronin is now all of a sudden out of the World Cup picture. He's still, you know, and that's the point Brendan makes, come the World Cup warm-up games, Sean Cronin is still your number 2 hooker because of what he gives you off the bench. So again, it's a bit of perspective.
He talks to Paul O'Connell as well. He tells a really good anecdote about when Jerry Flannery was first starting off at Munster. He had a really bad day with the line-outs, and O'Connell knew it wasn't Flannery's fault. There were timing issues and various things, and he actually went and explained to management afterwards that, honestly, I know you might think it's this new kid Flannery, but this one was on us. But even then, there was a slight scepticism in management. It's very hard for a number 2 to shake that stigma.
It is. You're completely exposed, aren't you, as the thrower? You really are. The Brendan Fanning piece is interesting as well because there's one great line that, like, I think the worry for people comes not that they're playing badly, or that they're not playing as well as they should, because like Bernard Jackman and a couple of people today don't think Ian, like, Wales are heroes at the moment after the great win of England, but they were gifted the win in Paris and they struggled against Italy. So, you know, let's not get carried away. But he does say, Brendan Fanning has a great line. He says, the good news is that Sexton won't sleep until he fixes this. The bad news is that Sexton won't sleep until he fixes this. That's a great line.
Yeah.
And that's, you can just see that with them, their frustration. But I think this is a really good follow-up. He says the challenge for the Ireland management team is to help him into a happier place so he can do his job. That's what they get paid for.
It was very notable after the England defeat that Schmidt made a point of saying that he had spoken to Sexton and Murray just to reassure them, we all have huge faith in you.
Yeah.
And Fanning Peter O'Reilly says, you know, people know that Schmidt is a control freak, his reputation is justified, but he says his soft skills are probably underestimated.
Yeah.
And that struck me as an example, that he went to Sexton and Murray, of all people, to reassure them from a confidence point
and Peter
of view.
O'Reilly also puts to bed that notion that, because I remember having this argument with somebody earlier last week when we were all a bit upset about whether Schmidt saying he was leaving early would be a factor. Like, what I was thinking was, hold on, Farrell is staying on, he's still there, and he says exactly the same thing, and he says Gatland is also departing post World Cup, maybe Eddie Jones also. So that notion as well, he kind of puts that to bed. The one thing I thought was interesting here, Cian, was he does show this, he does a little statistical thing here, and he says Six Nations stats where Ireland are bottom, right? Most offloads, France, Ireland are bottom with 8. Now England only have 15, which I think is really interesting, but that's an area that people have questioned. And then the turnovers, England 23 and then Ireland 11, they're the bottom.
Turnovers 1, yeah.
Yeah, turnovers 1. So I think those two stats are interesting. There's a piece by Rory Keane in the Mail today, and there's a lot of stuff about, what are we doing wrong, where are we going wrong, whatever, but he just kind of does a really small column, 4 points, fix the line out, fix the line speed, what were the other ones? Win the gain line, get the kicking right, and maybe take a bit more risks. And like that really summarised a lot of what we're looking at.
Yeah, the Peter O'Reilly piece is very interesting because the availability of the stats that we're getting now, these kind of ones would be available anyway, but this Six Nations has opened up a whole new prism in terms of how you're able to look at the game and stuff, and it's something I've been using as well. It's the kind of thing that coaches will readily have available, but we haven't been able to get access, I presume, unless you paid a lot of money for it, but thankfully the Six Nations are making it available. But it allows, I guess, us to paint a different picture for people that what's actually going on. I did a piece about Quinn Roux, and he's probably one player who gets criticised a lot in terms of what is he actually doing on the pitch, because he's not a James Ryan who's carrying the ball 15 times, he's not making a huge amount of tackles, but he's hugely effective at the ruck. Now, that's something I think that Peter O'Reilly's kind of touching on here. the most offloads. Ireland have never been a team who offload the ball. The turnovers 11. That's been a huge issue. The breakdown. I think it's going to be very interesting to see the team selection this week, because in Tadhg Byrne you have probably the best poacher in Europe. He's fit again now. Does he come back into the team? He'd give you a different threat. Dan Levy's the same. I think they've been back. He's back. Whether or not they're going to throw him into a game that big without having the game time under his belt is another matter. But I think they've badly missed him as well. But yeah, it's a really good piece, and he makes a point which I would agree with as well, that
the Steve Hansen one, is it now?
The one about Gary Ringrose. So it helps that he'll be able to call upon significant reinforcements this week in the form of Stander, Ryan, Healy, Best, and especially Gary Ringrose. One playmaker who can relieve some of the pressure on Sexton, and he'll need that against France. That's a great point. We know what France are going to do to Johnny Sexton. They do it every time, and every other team is starting to do it now. But we're not asking Johnny Sexton to change the way he plays, but I think what I would like to see is those around him helping take pressure off him.
Absolutely.
Like, there's no reason why Gary Ringrose can't step into first receiver and vary the game plan a little bit deeper. That would actually make Ireland's attack, I think, more potent as well. And yeah, it's something with the chopping and changing that's been done in the centre, and Schmidt has kind of mentioned it. It's a bit unfair to ask Chris Farrell to come in and play 13 when he's still trying to find his feet to do the role. But Ringrose has much more experience there. He started to do it for Leinster this season, and I think he can start doing it for Ireland as well. I think he was badly missed, I think, in the last game as well. Yeah,
he's a phenomenal player, really. Seeing as you have Peter Riley's piece open, if you just turn over the page to page 7, you have Bismarck to Plessis.
Yeah.
With David Walsh, Cliona, and I mean, there's lovely family stuff, and Walsh has obviously got to spend time with the du Plessis.
Yeah, down in Montpellier.
Family, and yet, if you were to say to someone, why should you read this? It's the painkiller conversation, isn't it? Ultimately, that's
I mean, there's a couple of things about it. One is about the Plessis' family's relationship with their black neighbours, with apartheid, and how they were, they were on anti-apartheid, and they were very strong in that way. And his children speak Sotho, which is an African language, which is really interesting as well. But so there's that element of it, and it's really interesting. And he's still running the farm from Montpellier, which I found fascinating as well, which is a massive farm back in South Africa. But the thing that will jump out, and I mean, I just thought Brian O'Driscoll the minute I read it, and it's really shocking. He talks about the injuries that he's had, and he talks at one stage he had a hernia removed eventually, but he talks
I think
at one stage,
a neck injury is the genesis of it.
And he couldn't sleep in the same bed as his wife because he needed painkillers every 3 or 4 hours. And he says the pins and needles went down to the last 2 fingers of my left hand, but I never stopped playing. I needed painkillers to play, to train and sleep. Driving to training, I had a pillow under my left arm because in its natural position it was too much, and he ate yogurt because when you take all those painkillers they affect your stomach. And I just thought, I mean, that's unnatural. Yeah. The pins and needles went down your left hand, and he's playing top level rugby. Like any of us, I think, if your hand was that sore, you probably wouldn't go to the gym.
I did think, as I was reading it, where he talked about the pins and needles going down to his last fingers, and I had the pillow in the car with him to put his hand in a certain position. I did think he was going to get to the point where he said, that was my period out injured. That was my recuperation.
He played through that.
But this is on the way to training, and he's playing, and he's popping painkillers every 3-4 hours.
You do have to ask about, professional sport and medics taking care of players, and how do they presume they're going to continue playing? First of all, play at a top level with that struggle, and secondly, what effect will it have on them long term? And it just did underline to me, if players need painkillers to be playing rugby, and Brian O'Driscoll got in a lot of hot water for saying it, I think, didn't he? That's not healthy, and that's not a good sign for the sport.
It's crazy. The game has a big problem in this respect. I'm not sure what the solution is. We've had many a discussion here, and the general refrain has been, well, how can you take the physicality out of rugby?
That's something that he goes on to talk about. It's a really interesting piece, because when you open it, like you said, the start of it is all about his family, and it's really nice. He's having lunch with them, but I think the picture in this is really powerful, with his twins and his wife, and then when you see what he's actually putting his body through and taking the painkillers, I think that's a pretty powerful picture to go with what he's actually saying. The headline is, I played in terrible pain, would I do it again? Probably. And there he is smiling with his kids. It's a powerful image. He goes on to talk about the physicality in the game, and mentions Pat Lambie, who unfortunately recently had to retire from concussion. And Du Plessis' brother Yanni also plays with him at Montpellier, and he's a qualified surgeon.
Yeah.
So they're making a point that players are being asked to tackle lower, but then you're risking hitting hips, because he says here, my brother Yanni, a teammate at Montpellier and a surgeon, says when surgeons need bone, they graft it from the hip because hip bone is the hardest. That's something I probably didn't really realise either. And then when you're asking young kids, you know, to tackle lower around the hip, it's not great, is it? It's,
and he says the game in the Southern Hemisphere is safer because it's quicker. He's saying French top 14 ball isn't in play long enough, and obviously you're taking the hits again.
Yeah.
But it's a very instructive piece because it echoes so much we're hearing about just the level of injury and also players having to play through injury and pain. I don't understand that.
Because people would have seen the reaction that Brian O'Driscoll generated.
Yeah.
I'm sure this will get a big enough reaction, the Du Plessis thing, so players will stop admitting what they're taking painkiller wise, but we can very safely assume it's going on and that painkillers in the game are being abused. And like, I would consider taking one every 3 hours and still playing. That's an abuse.
Having to take them during the night repeatedly, yeah.
I'm still playing.
Yeah, and still playing.
If you did that in your daily life, if you weren't a professional, you'd be concerned.
You wouldn't go if you had pins and needles coming down your fingers and your arm is that sore. You wouldn't go to the gym. Do you know what I mean? Because you'd be thinking, hold on, what kind of long-term damage am I doing?
I'd wangle a few days off the ball.
I get a few days out of it as well. But my point is, what always amazed me is, and I thought this had changed in rugby when it went professional, because I used to watch it in American football, and I think, why are they leaving that injured player on the pitch, right? Because he's worth so much money to them. Surely it's in their interest to take care of him and keep him as healthy and fit as possible. Or are they simply just disposable, you know, pieces of meat that when, you know, the body runs out, we'll pass them on, it doesn't matter, we've so many more coming. It's frightening stuff.
Different culture in France, not in terms of the painkillers, but Paul O'Connell did an interview recently and he was saying that in Stade Francais they don't have a full-time nutritionist. I know that's a little bit different, but that is, like, I couldn't believe that.
Shocking.
Like, when you consider schools teams up and down the countries have nutritionists who are working for him, and one of the top 14, a pretty wealthy Parisian club, don't have a full-time nutritionist. It's a different culture in France, and I do think they look at their players a bit differently than what they do over here.
Yeah, in terms of disposability, yeah, but I would think players' attitudes to painkillers are the same the world over, unfortunately. And I don't really know how you sort it out. It's going to be a big next generation or two for rugby to try and...
I thought this piece was really, we were just saying, I think this piece is really interesting as well when you look at Hugh Farrelly's piece on Bernard Laporte.
We come to that after just one quick ad break. We're going to take a short break. There's loads of other stuff we're going to get to as well beyond the rugby in just a few moments' time. We'll just finish up the rugby, which we were doing before the ad break. You were mentioning piece that caught all our eyes, a little bit different, I think. Good thing to do during the week. Bernard Laporte, a very famous figure. Like, we've seen him for close to 2 decades now in our lives.
Yeah.
And yet you read Hugh Gallagher's piece and you learn lots about him.
Yeah, Hugh Farrelly's piece, and actually the interesting thing, the interesting thing is, as well as we were saying, there's so much back reflection instead of maybe looking forward to the matches next week, because the Sunday papers will, you know, be done by the time they come around. So I think he did the right thing, which was looking ahead to the next game. Crazy Bernie is the headline, and of course you're immediately in. And Hugh Farrelly's a lovely writer. The first paragraph is fantastic. He's been likened to Mr. Slugworth character in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and also
Mr. Slugworth.
Mr. Slugworth.
The great characters.
And he says he's also figured prominently in Les Guignols, excuse my French pronunciation, The Puppets, which is France's answer to the Spitting Image, where he is depicted as a maniacal rugby dictator. And then Hugh proceeds to give us chapter and verse, all the history really of Laporte, where he started. I hadn't realised that he actually was part of Sarkozy's government as Secretary of Sport. And it's really interesting because through it all as well is kind of the link between politics, left wing and right wing in French society and in sport, and how much the crossover is there. And so it's a really good piece. The thing that freaks me out completely though about Laporte, and I remember seeing him keenly probably when the Women's World Cup was here he was over here, and everyone was noticing, even out in UCD, how well he was schmoozing people, because they were bidding for the Men's World Cup at the time, and everyone was going, watch Laporte, look what he's doing. I remember watching him one day, and he really could glad handle people. He was really good at it. So Hugh talks about that as well. Cian will talk probably about the Moed Altred connection, which is really interesting, which I didn't know about either, about the fact that France never had a sponsor on their jersey before. But when they lost to England, right, the players returned to camp in Marcoussis, and it was Laporte, not Brunel, who delivered the enough is enough speech, and that's the equivalent of Philip Brown going in and taking training.
It is, yeah.
Like, that's just
Well, if
bizarre.
Philip Brown had coached Ireland before, we'll give it, it's not as bad, but it's quite bad.
It is bizarre, though, isn't it? It's an incredible, and I suppose the whole history of it is very interesting, but also, I suppose, Hugh Farley's tenor is really, you never quite know what to expect with France, and we don't know what's going to happen next week, and here's an example of it.
Well, he said as well that not only did he give the speech to say enough is enough after the England defeat, but then he was taking part in training. He took an active role in training.
He took an active role in training.
Ahead of the Scottish game. So
that's what I'm saying.
Is he working with the players now?
Who knows?
We don't know. He may well be.
The feeling is that he is the one calling the shots.
He's the one calling the
behind
shots.
the scenes, but that wouldn't really make too much sense with the bizarre French team selections either. Like, so it's very hard to know what's going on.
But I think Hugh Farley's almost implying that it was Brunel up until the England defeat, and then Laporte almost stepped in and said, right, I'm now calling the shots. Yeah,
because I think that their team selection for the Ireland game the weekend coming is going to be very interesting, because, you know, picking Dupont and Ntamack at half-back, that's what people would perceive as, you know, the future. But the future is now, because, like Cliona said, when they won the rights to host the World Cup, it seems like they have this glut of really exciting players coming through that they're building towards 2023.
Yeah.
But the reality is these players are coming through now, so why would you block them for, we'll say, Morgan Parra has looked so sluggish in the early weeks of the Six Nations, Camille Lopez, and you've got these guys knocking on the door. So if there's consistency in selection again this weekend, maybe they have turned a corner, and you wouldn't back against them by the time they arrive in Japan to, you know, have gotten their house in order.
It's really nicely laid out. Like, sometimes, look, I know some people might think, oh, it's not the way to do it, but he just breaks it down into very digestible sections with headings. So it has like the player, and it talks about how he was a scrum half in his day, and then it has coaching education, and he took Stade Francais from the 3rd division up to the 1998 French Championship, leading Les Bleus, Grand Slams in 02, 04, Six Nations 06, 07. Then you mentioned he was part of Sarkozy's cabinet. And on he goes to the French Federation. The Mohed Altrad connection is a very contentious one over in France. They're not happy with this, because the piece starts off with the fact that they cut to his face in the ground after the Scotland match when France had won, and suddenly all the happiness and the flags, they started booing Laporte in the Stade de France. So they're not happy with him in many ways. The Altrad connection, like, there are lots of allegations about what's going on here, you know. They sponsor the jersey for $7 million a year. His close association is often talked about in those terms, you know. They used his funding to fund the 2023 bid for the World Cup in France. Financial sweeteners being directed to all the right pockets, says Hugh. Altrad himself is an amazing fella, though. I didn't know anything about him. His story is absolutely unbelievable.
I remember Jerry Thornley did a really good piece on him. I think it was last year or the year before that. I thought it was a really interesting piece. Yeah. He has the most amazing background. Yeah.
So he was he's from Syria, and he was destined to be a shepherd.
Yeah.
And yet, the opposite to most worlds, he would sneak to school instead, as opposed to sneaking out of school. He would sneak to school, applied for a government scholarship in France in Montpellier, despite not having a word of French, went on to do degrees in maths and physics, did a PhD in computer science, worked for 4 years in Abu Dhabi in the oil industry, returned to France, established a scaffolding company, and now the turnover of that company is 3.9 billion. He has 40,000 employees worldwide. Okay, there are some questions around the fringes of how he does his business, I'm sure, but that is an impressive bloody story all the same.
Yeah, now you could probably also reflect the fine line in that piece. He has just a little biog of him. Altrad has written 4 books chronicling his life experiences and business philosophies.
Got an ego.